Hi, I'm Janann Ferry. I'm an audiologist in private practice in Oak Park, Illinois, specializing in evaluation and treatment of central auditory processing disorders among children and adults. And I'm here today to talk about differential diagnosis of CAPDs and some practical tips as you look at the test results. This is the system with which we're dealing. The picture here of the ear represents the peripheral auditory mechanism: outer ear, middle ear, inner ear, and the auditory nerve. That system is responsible for collecting the sound, detecting it, and turning it into something the brain and brainstem can use. The central mechanism shown here are the centers in the brain and brainstem that help us interpret the information that the ear sends up to us. Any listener has to do all 5 of these things that are here: attend to the target, discriminate it, integrate it, associate it, and then create an output. Attention here refers to the ability to listen with both ears at the same time, for divided attention, or listen to one target and ignore something else, so selective attention. Discrimination is the brain's ability to analyze what it hears in terms of pitch, loudness, and timing, the 3 basic sounds components of all sounds. Once we've analyzed the information, then we're going to integrate it. Instead of just a piece and a piece and a piece, the auditory centers on the right side of the brain work with the auditory centers on the left side. You pull everything together so that the k, at turns into cat, or act, or tack, whatever order it's come in. Once we've analyzed the information and then synthesized it, then that information is going to move from the auditory center out to the language centers, also referred to as the association cortex. Your language kicks in. Your brain says, "Oh, cat, you said cat. I know what a cat is." And then I can do something with it. Output here refers to the umbrella term to describe our ability to organize information, sequence it, recall it, sing the song, tell the joke, answer the question, whatever you need to do. So it really is a process that starts at your ear and ends when you execute the response. A problem at the peripheral system is a hearing loss. A problem anywhere else along the way is considered some kind of processing problem. As you can see here, this represents then a continuum of skills. We have acoustic processing, that ability to detect, analyze, and synthesize, moving into a phonologic linguistic phase where we attach meaning and integrate the auditory with other sensory information. And then finally it becomes a linguistic cognitive phase where we organize the information in order to execute a response, maintain our focus to the signal, just do what we need to do with the information. So it really is a process. As audiologists and speech-language pathologists, we have a responsibility to click through all these different areas to find out where the problem may reside in order to plan effective intervention. The central auditory component of this represents then the neural processing of the auditory information, specifically auditory discrimination, temporal processing, and binaural processing. A deficiency in any of these 3 skill areas represents a central auditory processing disorder. Auditory discrimination refers to that ability to analyze those acoustic differences in the speech spectra. Temporal processing is all about using timing in all of its forms. How long is the target? How quickly does the target change over time? What kind of pattern is there? Is it ABA or BAB? Was it k-at or t-ak? What's the overall duration of the entire signal? Binaural processing represents the communication between the 2 sides of the brain. At the brainstem level, we have the interaction of the 2 ears to help us with localization and listening in noise. At the cortical level, it's all about integrating information in order to take in more and more information to be able to follow directions or keep up with a conversation or take notes. Separation is that ability to focus on one target and ignore any other extraneous information that may be going on. So to be a good listener and a good learner, we're going to need all three of these skill sets in order to use the information that comes into us. The testing that we're going to do is designed to look at these three areas to see where along the way the breakdown occurs, what's driving the bus, basically. We're going to use a battery of tests that are specifically designed to overwork the auditory system. There's over 1 million cells in this system capable of responding to auditory information. The only way to find out how well it works is to overwork it. I've got a battery of tests that look at those discrimination skills, the binaural skills, and the temporal skills. I'm going to compare my listener's performance to an age-matched peer group. Where you're within normal limits, this is a good thing. Outside normal limits is a potential problem. And then by looking at the patterns that emerge in the testing, where the listener struggled, where they did fine, we're able to develop performance profiles that determine both the presence or absence of a disorder and then help us define the specific nature of the problem. Does it relate more to pure acoustic processing, discrimination, binaural processing, or temporal processing? Or is this broad processing problem tied up in something of a more phonologic linguistic nature or something that relates more to the execution executive components? This is just a graphic to show you some of the tests that we use and the areas that underlie those skill sets in the central nervous system. Binaural fusion here and masking level difference get at the brainstem level interaction between the two ears. Your degraded speech tasks, as we call them, are low-pass filtered speech and TCR time compression. This is looking at that cortical and high brainstem-based auditory closure and discrimination. Next, we have all the dichotics. Dichotic is a Greek word, two and chaos. So these are tasks that involve something different in both ears at the same time, numbers, words, sentences, and it's going to get at the cortical level function, specifically right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and the interhemispheric connections across the corpus callosum. Our patterning tasks, there's two different types. We have patterning for pitch and duration. Then we also have temporal processing tested with temporal resolution using random gap detection or gaps in noise. Again, looking at cortical function, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and corpus callosum. Once I start interpreting the test results, we're going to look for these patterns. It's not a central auditory processing disorder if you have a single test that's below normal. On any given day, any given listener is going to have some difficulty with one of these tasks. Similarly, if performance is truly abnormal on everything that I ask my listener to do, and I mean everything, that's not considered a central auditory processing disorder. And if you think about it neurogeographically, that should make sense to you, because if you really are poor at everything I've asked you to do, these are tests that tap brainstem, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and corpus callosum, then that means something's wrong with the entire system, and it's not specific to the central auditory nervous system. We look for contradictory findings, scores that just don't make sense. A right ear off on one test, but a left ear off on another test where the two don't fit together. Instead, evidence of central auditory processing disorder are poor scores on sets of tests tapping similar skills. The model that I use to interpret central auditory tests is the Bellis-Ferry model. I'm kind of fond of it. It's got my name on it, so I figure I should use it. There are 3 primary central auditory processing test profiles and 2 secondary. The 3 primary profiles represent true central auditory processing disorder. The 2 secondary profiles are very unique sets of tests, but they're not CAPD. CAPD. The primary central auditory processing disorders are the decoding deficit, the integration deficit, and the prosodic deficit. The decoding deficit is a discrimination-based problem, primarily localized to the left hemisphere, might also involve high brainstem, but it's all about the system's ability to not extract, so rather an inability to extract those pitch, loudness, and timing cues. The tests that we're looking at for this deficit are those degraded speech tests. It's based on the notion that if your auditory system is extracting the pitch cues, the loudness cues, the timing cues the way it should be, even if I give you a degraded target, there's just enough left for your brain to figure out what it heard. If your system's not doing a good job of extracting the information, then by the time these degraded signals get to your cortex, it's auditory wheel of fortune. And there's just big gaps in the information, and you cannot attach meaning to it. So the decoding deficit is considered probably the truest of all the central auditory deficits because it's purely auditory, and it's all about the system not doing a good job of pulling out those little pieces of information. I had 2 8-year-old clients, brothers, and never forget them. The one was a poor decoder. His brother had a slightly different issue. And I said, go in the waiting room and get the coloring books with the bears on them and color the bears brown. And they said, okay. And out they ran, and my weak little decoder turned to his brother and said, what color were those bears supposed to be? His brother, who had a different issue, was holding all of the coloring books and the storybooks and my People magazines. And he turned to his brother and said, Brown, what were we supposed to do? Because his brother had an integration problem. The first brother missed a little piece of information, the color of the bears, but knew what he was supposed to do. The other brother with the integration deficit, a deficit in the interhemispheric communication, had all of the pieces but couldn't make them come together. So integration is all about the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain pulling the information together so that I can use it. And in terms of long-term learning, that's a pretty big deal because you could be a super great discriminator, but if you can't make it come together so that you can then attach meaning, you're going to be kind of dead in the water for reading and spelling and written language and other things you need to do. So the integrative deficit is all about poor synthesis. Just too much coming at the listener too quickly. I don't know how to put it all together. I call weak integrators my little 386 processors in a Pentium 2 kind of world. That as long as there's not too much coming at you too quickly, you can get that old computer to do whatever you need it to do. But if it starts going too fast or there's too much, then the whole system's going to crash. Now finally we have the prosodic deficit. That's going to be a right hemisphere-based problem. In fact, the prosodic deficit is referred to very often as right hemisphere auditory processing disorder. It's all about problems with the gestalt, especially the temporal gestalt. And it's an odd kind of a mix of poor analysis and poor synthesis, but it's all localized to the right side of the brain. So think about prosody as the music of language. Our language, as we listen to it, it rises and falls, it ebbs and it flows. And not only do we use the words we hear to extract the meaning, it's the way you say it. That rising intonation is the question that is being asked. Or you're really excited, so you get louder. And we have to pull out those pieces of information in order to attach meaning not just to the words, but to the subtext. And our listeners with prosodic deficit have a lot of difficulty pulling out those key pieces of information. For them, everything starts kind of hilly and wavy, and then it all flattens out and just begins to drone. I think after a while, these kids start to hear wah, 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 like Charlie Brown grown-ups. And so they have breakdowns then that relate not just to understanding speech, but a lot of issues in terms of social and pragmatic language to pick up that tone of voice. So these are the true central auditory processing issues because we can localize them to left hemisphere, corpus callosum, right hemisphere. Now I want to show you Cam. Cam came to see me 10 years old. You'll notice here some difficulty on low-pass filtered speech, time-compressed speech, the gaps in noise test. He had a very large gap detection threshold on that test along the lines of about 10 milliseconds. He needed a lot of time between targets to recognize that there in fact were two of them there. He had excellent performance on dichotic digits. He had a lot of difficulty on the staggered spondaic word test, particularly where the words overlap with each other. He didn't have any trouble with competing sentences and did a great job when I asked him to label the pitch patterns. So you look at the profile, and the thing that should jump out at you here, if you figured it out yet, is that this is a decoding deficit. A lot of difficulty on the tests that are tapping into auditory discrimination. In this case, significantly greater difficulty on the linguistically loaded dichotic test with good scores for the numbers. And that's a key component and a key feature of the decoding deficit is that the binaural processing tests are affected, but it tends to be the binaural tasks that have a heavy linguistic load, not the less linguistically loaded digits tasks that we sometimes use. And then the other key feature is that the temporal processing is in pretty good shape, okay? I want to show you Sergio. Sergio was an interesting youngster that I just saw within the last year. One of the things you'll notice here is that he had some difficulty on filtered words, but not on time compression. He had no difficulty on digits, but some trouble on dichotic rhyme and competing sentences. And then the thing that really threw me off with Sergio was when I got to the patterning tasks. We started with pitch patterns, and he had a terrible time labeling and imitating these patterns. And when I switched it up to duration patterns, the duration patterns sound more like Morse code, kind of a hoo, 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 as opposed to the high, low, high kind of thing. And I was a little thrown off by that. And I started looking at the pattern, and I thought, all right, there's an element here of maybe some discrimination, but we're off on the binaurals, and we had some trouble on the patterning task, but only one of them. And then I had my aha moment, and I said, right, mixed performance on the discrimination, a lot of difficulty on the discrim-based task that involved frequency discrimination, low-pass filtered speech, but not time. Difficulty on those more linguistically loaded dichotic tasks. Difficulty with frequency patterns, but not duration patterns. So this is a youngster that we're not calling it a decoding deficit per se. We're actually getting even more specific and pointing out that this really is a pure discrimination deficit specific to his ability to extract frequency cues. Now, from a management standpoint, this youngster in particular is going to be the youngster who's going to benefit from an FM system, because the FM system is designed to enhance those frequency contrasts. So don't let the mixed bag here throw you off into thinking, oh, it's not really a CAPD because look, he had a trouble here and trouble here and trouble here. It's not that he had trouble on all the types of tasks. You have to go under that and say, well, what was the nature of the trouble that he had? And in this case, very specific to the frequency extraction capabilities of the system. This is Rachel. Rachel was 9 years old when I saw her. She's one of my favorite clients. I'm going to say it again. She was 9 years old. She's in the second grade. She was referred to me by her neuropsychologist due to failure to thrive academically, doing math at a third grade level, and yet reading, writing, and spelling at a kindergarten level. I brought Rachel because Rachel is what I would call kind of textbook of the integration deficit. So you'll notice here normal performance on the degraded speech tasks, filtered words, and time compression, below normal limits for the left ear on dichotic digits, below normal limits on the left ear only for competing sentences, below normal limits both ears, but the left ear significantly poorer than the right ear on the staggered spondaic word test. And then the classic piece of information is not able to label the tonal patterns, but beautiful imitation. And this one is kind of classically that corpus callosum integration deficit. Adequate performance on your tasks that are tapping discrimination skills, excessive left ear suppression on the dichotics, and the poor labeling of tonal patterns with adequate imitation. The and is very, very important. You need both of those component pieces, the left ear suppression and the poor labeling with good mimicking to diagnose the integration deficit. So this is one of those cases of not being able to synthesize information. That left ear target was getting lost as it was trying to move from the right hemisphere over to the left hemisphere. Ryan, to contrast with Rachel, notice again the good performance on the degraded speech tasks, normal performance on filtered words and time compression. We have left ear suppression right across all three dichotics, digits, rhyme, and competing sentences. But notice, please, in this case, Ryan could neither label nor imitate the temporal patterns. This one is the prosodic deficit, that right hemisphere-based problem where you have adequate discrimination, which is left hemisphere. The target could not get out of the right hemisphere, which is why you see the left ear suppression on the dichotics. But because of the right hemisphere locus of dysfunction, he could not even imitate the patterns that he was hearing. And if you can't imitate, you probably can't label them. And so this one is the right hemisphere-based auditory processing disorder. A lot of difficulty analyzing what he hears and synthesizing and attaching meaning and organizing, but all based on the right side of the brain. I want to talk a little bit about the secondary patterns. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these are unique profiles that will show up on central auditory processing tests, but they're not central auditory processing disorder. And this is a big mistake that new CAPD testers kind of run into, that you see the poor scores on these auditory tests and your brain wants to say, oh, it's an auditory processing disorder. Yeah, it's a processing disorder along that continuum, but it's not auditory. It's on the upper levels of the continuum. The first is the associative deficit, and we are absolutely convinced that this is reflecting some sort of a language processing impairment. I can hear what you're saying, but I'm not attaching meaning to it. So we've called it the associative deficit because we believe that the breakdown is a disruption in how well Heschel's gyrus is talking to Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is the predominant region for the association cortex, and so the auditory is not linking up with the linguistic. The other secondary pattern is the output organization deficit. We believe it's reflecting some sort of cognitive, linguistic, executive issue, likely site of dysfunction, frontal lobe, motor, premotor cortex, because it's all about organizing the information. I had one little guy said to me, and this was just a few months ago, he looked at me and he said, Dr. Ferry, I have all my ducks, they're just not in a row. And I said, yes, that would be the output organization deficit. You have all your ducks, they're just not in a row. So I brought a couple of youngsters to show you these patterns. This is Mark. One of the things I want to point out, what gives this away is the associative, is you will notice the very nice performance on the degraded speech tasks, low pass filtered and time compression, and the normal performance on pitch patterns, but it's all about the dichotics in this case. And one of the things I want to mention about Mark is 12, and it showed up mostly here in dichotic digits. You'll notice that the right ear score is within normal limits, but the left ear is showing the suppression. When we get to the tasks that have a heavy linguistic loading, both ears become suppressed. So when you're dealing with younger children, 6, 7, 8 years old, you are very likely going to see bilateral suppression on the dichotics for this associative deficit. As these kids get older, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, it's going to start to turn into a left ear suppression, and you're going to want to think it's integrative, but it's not. This is where you really have to look at your dichotics versus your patterning. If I am down on my dichotics, but I'm good on my patterning, then it's this associative deficit. It's not the integrative deficit, okay? I brought Alex for you to see. Alex is kind of, again, a textbook example of the output organization problem. He did well on degraded speech tasks. He was off on dichotic digits. He did well on rhyme. On the SSW test, almost half of the items he reported out of sequence. So instead of upstairs, downtown, he said uptown, downstairs. So he had the right words, but they were out of order. He did the same thing with pitch patterns. The score ended up below normal because almost half of them he said backwards. And he actually sang them backwards for me. So he's given me high, low, low, high. So he's saying the wrong words, but he's got the right pitches to go with it. And this is the output organization problem. Decent discrimination performance on those degraded speech tasks. You start to look at the tasks that have multiple targets, dichotic digits, 4 digits, SSW, 4 words, adequate absolute scores on the SSW, a lot of ordering errors, and that's the giveaway for these students, is that I've got all the information in my head, but I'm not able to get it sequenced out the way I need to. I brought one more to show you, and this is my favorite one. I just saw Aiden within the last 3 months, and he was making my graduate students crazy because look what he did here. Normal performance on filtered words, normal performance on time compression, normal performance on dichotic digits, normal sentences. I've got left ear suppression only on dichotic rhyme. He didn't seem able to label, but he could mimic. And they all stood around and said, And I said, look for a pattern, no CAPD, okay? There are any number of explanations for why he could have been off just on dichotic rhyme. This is a very, very hard task. 2 words that rhyme with each other, and you're not going to hear both of them. The labeling task happened to be the last thing that we did, could have been fatigue. It was my opinion that these are, although there are 2 scores that were off in this battery, we do not have a clear pattern of specific central auditory processing disorder. So I referred him back to his neuropsychologist. The diagnosis is attention deficit disorder, which could also probably explain why he did what he did, okay? So in summary, this is a battery of very auditory specific tasks. One of the things I want you to remember is that no one task measures only one skill. And so you cannot diagnose based on one test. You have to step back from that and diagnose based on the battery. I tell my graduate students all the time, we're looking for the tie that binds. Connect those dots. Don't ignore contradictory findings. Embrace them And then the biggest issue for me is remember your neuroscience. Does what you just diagnosed make sense? And I'm going to give you a quick example. I read a report recently. The author of the report said that the youngster's gap detection threshold was 0 milliseconds. I read it twice, and I said, wait, 0 milliseconds is no gap. Your gap detection threshold is the smallest gap you can perceive. No gap makes no sense neurodiagnostically or neuroscientifically. You can't hear a gap that's not there. So step back from the diagnosis and walk yourself through neurogeographically. Does my diagnosis make sense with what I know about the central auditory nervous system? The treatment of these disorders can't be done with a cookbook approach, one from column A, one from column B, one from column C. The diagnostics can't be done with a cookbook approach. If you think about what you're doing and you remember your neuroscience, the diagnosis becomes clear, and then the treatment and the management is self-evident, excuse me. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm at jmfphd@comcast.net or dr-ferry.com if you want to get in touch with me. Thanks.